Story 1. The Weaver of Whispered Dreams Expanded. In the heart of an ancient valley, where morning mists danced with lotus petals, there lived a peculiar soul named Zephyrina Moon Whisper. She was neither young nor old, existing in that timeless space where wisdom meets wonder, her silver hair flowing like captured starlight and her eyes holding the depth of forgotten oceans. Her cottage sat beside a pond so still it mirrored not just the sky above, but the depths of eternity itself, its surface occasionally disturbed only by dragonflies, drawing temporary calligraphy with their delicate wings. The cottage itself seemed to breathe with the rhythm of the earth, its walls made of stones that had witnessed countless seasons, its roof thatched with reeds that whispered ancient songs in the evening breeze. Garden paths wound around the dwelling, like gentle serpents lined with herbs that released their fragrance only to those who walked with mindful steps. Lavender brushed against visitors' ankles, sage offered its wisdom to the wind, and chamomile nodded sleepily in the fading light. Each evening, as twilight painted the world in soft purples and golds, Zephyrina would perform her sacred ritual. She would walk barefoot to the water's edge, her feet reading the stories written in earth and stone, carrying a basket woven from moonbeams and patience. The basket had been crafted in a dream, she often told herself, though she could never quite remember when or how. It held nothing and everything, empty space, pregnant with infinite possibility. The lotus flowers recognized her presence, their petals opening like sleepy eyes, welcoming an old friend. These were no ordinary lotus blooms. They glowed with an inner light that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the universe itself. Pink ones held stories of love lost and found. White ones carried tales of purity discovered through struggle, and the rare blue ones whispered secrets of transformation that only the truly patient could understand. Tonight, like countless nights, before she settled cross-legged on her favorite meditation stone. The stone had been smoothed by generations of seekers, its surface warm with accumulated peace, and worn into the perfect seat for contemplation. Legend spoke of a time when this very stone had been the heart of a mountain, choosing to roll down into the valley to serve those who sought understanding. Whether true or not, Zephyrina felt the stone's ancient patience flowing up through her bones. She closed her eyes and began to breathe with the rhythm of the pond itself. Slow inhales that drew in the essence of lotus blossoms, gentle exhales that released the day's accumulated worries into the receptive darkness. Her breath became a bridge between the world of form and the realm of spirit. Each inhalation an invitation to the universe to speak. Each exhalation a letting go of the need to control what wisdom might come. As her breath deepened, something magical began to unfold. The reflections in the pond started to shimmer and shift the water's surface, becoming a window into lives both distant and near. Colors swirled in patterns that followed no earthly logic, forming images that spoke directly to the heart rather than the mind. The water sang in frequencies only the soul could hear, harmonies that told stories older than language itself. She saw a young merchant named Cornelius Lightbringer struggling with the weight of his family's expectations. His shoulders carried burdens heavier than his cart full of precious silks and spices, burdens invisible to the eye, but visible to hearts that knew how to truly see. He walked through marketplaces where vendors called out their wares, but Cornelius heard only the echoes of his father's disappointed sighs and his mother's worried whispers behind closed doors. In the pond's surface, Zephyrina watched as Cornelius sat beneath a willow tree, tears mixing with the morning dew on his cheeks. The willow's branches created a natural cathedral around him, its leaves rustling prayers for all who sought shelter beneath its graceful arms. He had failed again. Another business venture crumbled like sandcastles before the tide. His third attempt at following his father's merchant path had ended in financial ruin and social embarrassment. His father's voice echoed in his memory, sharp with disappointment. "Success is not a choice, Cornelius. It is a duty. Our family name has been built on prosperity, not on dreams and wishes." The words cut deeper than any blade, because they came wrapped in love and concern, making them impossible to simply dismiss or rebel against. But as Zephyrina observed through the pond's mystical lens, she noticed something Cornelius himself could not see. Each failure had taught him compassion. When he lost his first shop to a fire that consumed half the market district, he learned to understand other struggling merchants, offering them comfort and practical help during their darkest hours. When a second venture collapsed under the weight of dishonest partners, he discovered the art of listening to people's true needs rather than their spoken wants, developing an almost supernatural ability to hear the unspoken longing in a customer's voice. His failures were not endings, but transformations, like caterpillars dissolving into butterfly soup before emerging with wings capable of touching the sky. Each loss had stripped away a layer of pretense. Each disappointment had polished his heart until it shone with genuine care for others' well-being. The pond's reflection shifted, showing Cornelius years later, though time in the reflection moved like honey, sweet and slow. He sat in a humble tea house he had built with his own hands, serving customers who came not just for his excellent brew, but for his gentle wisdom and patient ear. The tea house was small, simple with mismatched chairs and tables that wobbled slightly, but it glowed with warmth that expensive establishments could never purchase. His failures had become his foundation, his struggles the very stones upon which his true success was built. Customers came to him, not because he was the most successful merchant in the city, but because he understood their struggles, their fears, their hopes. He had learned to serve not just tea, but healing presence, not just pastries, but nourishment for the soul. A wealthy businessman sat across from Cornelius, in the reflection tears streaming down his face, as he spoke of his empire's success and his heart's emptiness. Cornelius listened without judgment, offering neither advice nor false comfort, simply holding space for another's pain to be acknowledged and honored. This was the gift his failures had given him, the ability to sit with suffering without trying to fix it, to offer presence without demanding gratitude. Zephyrina smiled, understanding the lesson the Lotus Pond was teaching through Cornelius's story. She rose gracefully, her movements flowing like water, finding its natural course, and walked to her cottage where she kept a journal bound in leather, soft as whispered prayers. The journal's pages were made from paper that had been blessed by monks in a distant monastery, each sheet imbued with the intention of preserving wisdom for future seekers. By candlelight that danced like golden spirits, she wrote, "The lotus grows most beautiful in the deepest mud. Our struggles are not obstacles to our blossoming, but the very nourishment from which our wisdom grows. What we call failure is often life's way of teaching us skills we never knew we needed, preparing us for service we never imagined we could offer." As she closed the journal, its leather cover settling with a soft whisper, a gentle breeze carried the fragrance of lotus blossoms through her window. The scent spoke of transformation, of beauty, emerging from the most unlikely places of hope that blooms even in darkness. The pond's surface had returned to perfect stillness, reflecting only stars and the crescent moon. But Zephyrina knew that tomorrow evening new stories would emerge from those sacred waters, each one a gift wrapped in the gentle teaching of acceptance and growth. She extinguished her candle and settled into sleep, her dreams filled with lotus petals, floating on moonlit water, each one carrying a whispered truth about the beautiful imperfection of human existence. Lesson: our failures and struggles are not punishments but teachers transforming us into beings capable of deeper compassion and truer success than we ever imagined possible. Story 2. The Keeper of Forgotten Melodies. The following evening, as purple shadows stretched across the valley, like gentle fingers seeking rest, Zephyrina returned to her meditation stone beside the lotus pond. The air carried the promise of rain, heavy with moisture, that made every breath feel like drinking liquid peace. Tonight, the lotus blossoms seemed to glow with unusual intensity, their petals catching and holding starlight, as if they were celestial collectors, gathering dreams for safekeeping. She settled into her familiar position, feeling the stone's warmth rise to meet her bones. The day had been filled with small disruptions, a neighbor's concern about her missing cat letters, from distant friends sharing their worries, the general hum of human anxiety that seemed to permeate even the most peaceful places. But here beside the water that held all stories within its depths, such concerns began to dissolve, like morning frost touched by sunlight. As her breathing found its natural rhythm, the pond's surface began its mystical transformation. Tonight, the reflections swirled in patterns that resembled musical notes written in water and light. Colors danced in harmonies that the eye could see and the heart could hear, creating symphonies of meaning that transcended ordinary understanding. Within the shimmering depths appeared the figure of Melodia Starweaver, an elderly woman whose fingers moved constantly as if playing invisible instruments. She sat in a small room filled with musical instruments from every corner of the earth. Sitars from distant mountains, drums carved from ancient trees, flutes that had been blessed by desert winds, and violins that remembered the forests from which their wood had come. But Melodia was not playing any of these instruments tonight. Instead, she sat in perfect stillness, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes closed in what appeared to be profound sadness. Around her, the instruments gathered dust, their voices silenced by neglect and the weight of unexpressed grief. Through the pond's revelation, Zephyrina witnessed Melodia's story unfolding like a flower blooming in reverse. Once this woman had been the heart of her community's musical life. Every celebration, every morning ritual, every moment when human hearts needed the medicine of melody. Melodia had been there with her instruments and her gift for finding exactly the right sound to heal whatever needed healing. She had played lullabies for restless children, drawing sleep from her guitar strings, like a spider drawing silk from its body. She had composed wedding songs that captured the unique love story of each couple, melodies that would echo in their hearts through decades of shared life. When the community faced tragedies, floods that destroyed homes, illnesses that claimed beloved elders, conflicts that divided families, Melodia's music had been the thread that rewove the torn fabric of their collective spirit. But 3 years ago, something had shifted. During a particularly difficult winter, when food was scarce and spirits were low, Melodia had reached for her favorite violin to play comfort for the gathering crowd. As she drew the bow across the strings, expecting the familiar voice that had spoken through her hands for 40 years, only silence emerged. The violin, her most trusted companion, had lost its voice. She tried instrument after instrument, each one remaining mute beneath her increasingly desperate touch. The community waited patiently, trusting that their musical healer would find a way to reach them. But Melodia found only emptiness where melody had once lived. That night, she had returned home and never played publicly again. In the pond's reflection, Zephyrina watched as Melodia's silence had affected not just herself, but the entire community. Without their musical center, celebrations became flat and mechanical. Grief remained unprocessed, hanging over families like persistent storm clouds. Children grew restless without the lullabies that had once carried them safely into sleep. The community's heart had developed an irregular rhythm, missing the steady beat that Melodia's presence had provided. But tonight, as Zephyrina observed, something was beginning to shift. A small girl named Luna, no more than 7 years old, had appeared at Melodia's door, carrying a simple wooden recorder that she had carved herself from a branch fallen during the last storm. The girl's technique was rough, her breath control uncertain, but when she played her simple melody, something magical happened. Melodia's forgotten instruments began to respond, not with sound, but with subtle vibrations that seemed to recognize kindred spirit. The girl's pure intention to create beauty unmarred by expectations of perfection or fears of judgment awakened something that had been sleeping in the room's musical atmosphere. As Luna played her simple tune, Melodia began to remember something she had forgotten in her years of technical mastery and community responsibility. Music had never been about perfection or performance or even healing others. At its heart, music was about connection to the divine, to the moment, to the simple joy of creating something beautiful from nothing but breath and intention. Slowly, as if moving through water, Melodia reached for her simplest instrument, a small clay ocarina that she had made as a child before she learned proper technique or music theory. Her fingers found the familiar holes, and she began to play along with Luna's innocent melody. The sound that emerged was imperfect, rusty from disuse, but it carried something that her previous performances had gradually lost: pure love for the act of creation itself. The pond's reflection showed the ripple effects of this simple moment. As Melodia and Luna played together, neighbors began to gather outside the cottage, drawn by something they couldn't name, but desperately needed. One by one, they began to hum along, their voices, rough and untrained, but honest. A teenager brought out a guitar with a broken string, playing what he could. An elderly man began tapping rhythm on his walking stick. A mother sang wordless melodies while rocking her baby. They were not performing. They were simply being together in the language that souls understood best. The music was imperfect, full of missed notes and uncertain timing, but it was alive in a way that technical perfection could never be. It spoke of human vulnerability and the courage to create beauty despite uncertainty. Zephyrina watched as understanding dawned in Melodia's eyes. Her gift had never been her technical skill or her extensive knowledge of instruments. Her true gift was her ability to create space where others felt safe to express their own musical souls. She had been trying to carry the community's musical needs on her shoulders alone, but music was meant to be shared, created together, imperfect and beautiful, and essentially human. The reflection showed months passing in the fluid time of the pond's wisdom. Melodia's cottage became a gathering place once again, but different from before. Instead of performances where she played for others, evenings became collaborative explorations where everyone contributed whatever they could offer. Children brought homemade instruments. Adults shared half-remembered songs from their childhoods, and slowly, organically, a new kind of musical tradition began to grow. Melodia learned to find joy not in being the community's musical provider, but in being a facilitator of their collective creativity. Her instruments found their voices again, because they were no longer carrying the weight of perfection, but celebrating the beauty of shared imperfection. As the vision in the pond began to fade, Zephyrina rose from her meditation stone her heart full of the lessons she had witnessed. In her cottage, she opened her journal to a fresh page and wrote by candlelight, "The greatest gifts we offer others are not our perfections, but our willingness to create authentic connection. When we stop trying to be indispensable and start helping others discover their own voices, true harmony emerges from the beautiful chaos of human creativity." She closed the journal and prepared for sleep, humming a simple melody that came from nowhere and everywhere, imperfect and honest and alive, with the joy of being human. Lesson: our greatest service to others comes not from our perfection, but from creating space where they feel safe to express their own imperfect, authentic selves. Story 3. The Gardener of Invisible Seeds. The third evening arrived with the whisper of autumn's first breath, carrying the scent of changing leaves and the promise of harvest time. Zephyrina made her way to the Lotus Pond as twilight painted the sky in shades of amber and rose gold. The lotus blossoms seemed to pulse with a different energy tonight, their petals slightly closed, as if holding secrets close to their hearts, waiting for the right moment to reveal what wisdom they contained. She settled onto her meditation stone, feeling its familiar warmth seep into her bones. The day had been filled with the kind of quiet melancholy that sometimes visits sensitive souls, a yearning for something unnamed, a sense of incompleteness that couldn't be fixed by any external solution. But here, beside the water that held all stories, such feelings were not problems to be solved, but invitations to deeper understanding. As her breath found its natural rhythm, the pond began its mystical transformation. Tonight the reflections took the form of gardens, not ordinary gardens, but landscapes of possibility, where thoughts grew like plants and intentions bloomed into reality. The water showed scenes of cultivation that transcended the physical world, revealing the invisible agriculture of human consciousness. Within this garden of reflections appeared a figure, both striking and humble, Seraphina, Dirt Whisperer, a woman whose hands were permanently stained with soil, and whose eyes held the patience of someone who understood that the most important work happens unseen underground in darkness and silence. She tended a garden unlike any other, where the seeds she planted were not physical, but spiritual, and the harvest she gathered fed souls rather than bodies. Seraphina lived in a small cottage at the edge of town, where the civilized world met the wild places that remembered older ways of being. Her garden was a sanctuary that few understood, filled with plants that seemed to respond to emotions rather than weather flowers that bloomed according to the inner seasons of those who visited, and vegetables that nourished both body and spirit. But tonight, as Zephyrina watched through the pond's revelation, Seraphina faced a crisis that challenged everything she thought she knew about her calling. The garden was dying, not from disease or drought, but from something more mysterious, a gradual loss of vitality that seemed to mirror the spiritual exhaustion of the community around her. For 20 years, Seraphina had welcomed visitors to her garden. People came carrying burdens of grief, anxiety, anger, and fear, seeking the healing that seemed to emanate from the very soil she tended. She never advertised her gift or charged for her services. Instead, she simply created a space where people could sit among growing things and remember their own capacity for growth and renewal. Through the pond's vision, Zephyrina witnessed the countless quiet miracles that had unfolded in Seraphina's garden over the years. A businessman who had lost his way would spend an afternoon weeding vegetables and rediscover his sense of purpose. A mother, overwhelmed by the demands of raising children, would find peace sitting among the roses, her heart opening to self-compassion. Teenagers struggling with identity would help plant seeds and learn that growth happened in its own time, according to its own wisdom. But recently, something had shifted. The visitors who came to the garden arrived with a different kind of woundedness, a disconnection so profound that they seemed unable to receive the healing that surrounded them. They walked through the garden, with eyes glued to their phones, missing the miracle of morning glories, opening to greet the sun. They sat among the herbs, but remained trapped in their own mental prisons, unable to receive the medicine that nature offered freely. Serafina had tried everything she could think of. She planted new varieties of healing plants, created more inviting spaces for contemplation, even began offering gentle guidance to those who seemed most lost. But the garden's magic appeared to be fading, and she found herself questioning whether her life's work had any real meaning in a world that seemed increasingly disconnected from the natural rhythms of growth and healing. The pond's reflection showed Serafina on this particular evening kneeling beside a patch of earth where nothing would grow. She had planted seeds of compassion, watered them with tears of genuine care, and tended them with all the skill and love she possessed. But the ground remained barren, reflecting the spiritual barrenness she sensed in the world around her. As she knelt there in the fading light, feeling the weight of failure and purposelessness, a small movement caught her eye. A tiny green shoot was pushing through the soil, so small and delicate that it was almost invisible. But as Serafina looked closer, she realized this was no ordinary plant. It was growing from seeds she had planted, not in the earth, but in the hearts of the people who had visited her garden over the years. The pond's reflection expanded, showing Serafina scenes she had never witnessed. The businessman, who had rediscovered his purpose in her garden, was now running his company with unprecedented compassion, creating policies that supported his employees' well-being and donated profits to environmental causes. The overwhelmed mother was leading a support group for other parents, teaching them the self-compassion she had learned among the roses. The confused teenagers had grown into young adults who carried the garden's wisdom into their relationships, their careers, their own families. Each person who had found healing in Serafina's garden had become a seed carrier, planting invisible gardens in their own communities. The healing she had offered was multiplying exponentially, creating ripples of compassion and connection that spread far beyond what she could see or measure. The reflection showed her the truth she had forgotten. The most important seeds are planted not in soil, but in consciousness. The garden's purpose was never to heal people directly, but to remind them of their own capacity for growth, to model the patience and trust required for genuine transformation, and to send them out into the world as carriers of living wisdom. As this understanding dawned, Serafina felt something shift within herself. The garden's apparent decline was not a failure, but an invitation to trust more deeply in the invisible processes of spiritual growth. Like a master gardener who knows that the best work happens underground in darkness and silence, she was being called to have faith in the unseen harvest of her life's service. The pond's reflection showed her the future that was already unfolding. Her garden would continue to be a sanctuary for those who could receive its medicine, but its influence would extend far beyond its physical boundaries. Every person who had been touched by the peace they found there would carry that peace into their daily lives, creating micro-gardens of mindfulness in offices, schools, families, and communities. Serafina rose from her knees, her hands still stained with soil, but her heart lightened by understanding. She looked at her garden with new eyes, seeing not just the plants that grew there, but the invisible network of connection and healing that extended from this small patch of earth to every corner of the world, where former visitors now lived and loved and served. As the vision in the pond began to fade, Zephyrina felt a deep resonance with Serafina's story. She rose from her meditation stone and walked to her cottage, where she opened her journal and wrote, The seeds of greatest impact are often planted in moments of deepest doubt. When we cannot see the fruits of our service, we must trust that the most important harvest happens in the hidden gardens of human hearts, where compassion planted in one soul blooms into service that touches countless others. She closed the journal and prepared for sleep, her dreams filled with invisible gardens, where every act of kindness sprouted into forests of healing, where every moment of genuine presence planted seeds that would bloom in ways beyond imagination. Lesson: the most profound service we offer often works invisibly, planting seeds of transformation in others that will bloom long after we've forgotten the planting, creating harvests of healing that extend far beyond what we can see or measure. Story 4. The Mender of Broken Silences. The fourth evening brought with it the kind of stillness that makes the world feel larger and smaller simultaneously. Zephyrina walked to the Lotus Pond as the last light of day painted the sky in deep purples and soft grays, colors that seemed to hold the weight of unspoken words and unexpressed feelings. The lotus blossoms tonight appeared to be listening, their petals slightly cupped, as if ready to catch whatever wisdom might fall from the evening stars. She settled onto her meditation stone, feeling the accumulated warmth of 3 previous evenings still held within its surface. Tonight, there was a heaviness in the air, not unpleasant, but profound, like the moment before a storm, when the entire world holds its breath. She closed her eyes and began to breathe with the rhythm of her heartbeat, each inhale, drawing in the complexity of human experience, each exhale, releasing the need to understand everything at once. As her consciousness deepened, the pond's surface began its mystical transformation. Tonight, the reflections took the form of conversations, not the spoken kind, but the deeper dialogues that happen between souls, the unspoken communications that flow beneath the surface of everyday interaction. The water showed scenes of connection and disconnection of words that healed, and silences that wounded, of the delicate dance between speaking and listening that determines the quality of every relationship. Within these flowing conversations appeared the figure of Whisper Heartbridge, a woman whose entire being seemed designed for the art of deep listening. She moved through the world with the grace of someone who understood that the most important conversations happen not with words, but with presence, not with advice, but with the kind of witnessing that allows others to hear their own wisdom. Whisper lived in a small tea shop in the heart of a busy city, where the constant noise of traffic and commerce created a kind of sound barrier that kept people isolated within their own thoughts and worries. Her shop was different from the others on the street, not because of its appearance, which was simple and unassuming, but because of the quality of silence that lived within its walls. People came to Whisper's tea shop not just for the excellent tea she served, but for something they couldn't quite name. In a world filled with constant chatter, endless advice, and the pressure to always have something to say, her shop offered the rare gift of being heard without judgment, of being seen without being fixed, of being held in the kind of silence that actually speaks. But tonight, as Zephyrina watched through the pond's revelation, Whisper faced a challenge that tested the very foundation of her calling. A young man named Marcus had been coming to her shop every day for 3 weeks, sitting in the corner with untouched tea growing cold before him, his silence so thick with pain that it seemed to absorb sound from the entire room. Through the pond's vision, Zephyrina witnessed Marcus's story unfolding in layers. He was a talented artist whose work had once flowed from his hands like water from a spring. His paintings captured emotions that others couldn't express. His sculptures gave form to feelings that had no words, and his creativity had brought joy not just to himself, but to everyone who encountered his art. But 6 months ago, during a group exhibition that was supposed to launch his career, a well-meaning critic had published a review that dissected his work with surgical precision, finding flaws in every brushstroke and questioning his right to call himself an artist. The words had been written without malice, perhaps even with the intention of helping him improve, but they had landed in Marcus's heart like poison arrows, silencing the creative voice that had been his constant companion since childhood. Since reading that review, Marcus had been unable to create anything. His hands, once so confident with brush and clay, now trembled with self-doubt. His studio had become a monument to abandoned projects. Half-finished canvases turned to face the wall sculptures covered with cloth, like mourning shrouds. The silence in his creative life had spread to his social life, his relationships, his ability to engage with the world in any meaningful way. He came to Whisper's tea shop because it was the only place where his silence felt accepted rather than problematic. Other friends and family members tried to encourage him, offering advice and pep talks that only made him feel more broken. But Whisper simply served his tea, acknowledged his presence with a gentle nod, and allowed him to exist in his pain without trying to fix or change him. The pond's reflection showed Whisper's internal struggle as she watched Marcus day after day. Every instinct in her body wanted to reach out to offer words of comfort, to share her own experiences of overcoming creative blocks. She knew techniques for rebuilding confidence, exercises for reconnecting with artistic flow, wisdom traditions that could help him see his critics' words as one opinion rather than absolute truth. But deeper than her desire to help was her understanding of the sacred nature of silence. She had learned through years of deep listening that sometimes the most profound healing happens not through words, but through the patient presence of another soul who can sit with pain without trying to transform it. Some wounds need to be felt fully before they can be healed. Some silences need to be honored before they can give birth to new sound. As Zephyrina watched, she saw the delicate balance that Whisper maintained. Each day, Marcus arrived at the same time and sat in the same corner. Whisper would bring him tea without being asked sometimes, making gentle eye contact, sometimes simply existing in the same space without any pressure for interaction. She became a lighthouse for his ship, lost in a storm, not directing him where to go, but simply being a steady presence that said, "You are not alone in this darkness." The breakthrough came not through words, but through the kind of silence that speaks directly to the soul. On the 21st day of Marcus's visits, as he sat with his cold tea and heavy heart, Whisper did something unprecedented. Instead of maintaining her usual respectful distance, she sat down at his table and began to cry. The tears came not from sadness, but from the overwhelming recognition of shared human fragility. In that moment, Marcus realized that his silence had been witnessed, not as a failure or a problem to be solved, but as a sacred expression of the human experience of being wounded and needing time to heal. For the first time in months, Marcus spoke, not words of explanation or apology, but a simple acknowledgement. "Thank you for sitting with me." Whisper's response was equally simple. "Thank you for letting me." The pond's reflection showed what happened in the days that followed. Marcus began to speak, not about his art or his pain, but about small things. The way light fell across his table, the taste of tea, the sound of rain against the shop's windows. Each word was like a tentative step back toward the world of connection and expression. Whisper listened to each word as if it were a precious gift, because she understood that creativity and communication are not separate things, but aspects of the same human impulse to share what lives inside us. By creating space for Marcus's silence, She had helped him find his way back to the courage required for any form of expression. Weeks later, Marcus brought Whisper a small painting, not of anything specific, just colors and shapes that somehow captured the feeling of being held in understanding silence. It was the first art he had created since the devastating review, and it vibrated with a new kind of depth, a beauty that could only come from someone who had traveled through the valley of silence and emerged with greater appreciation for the courage required to speak. The vision in the pond showed the ripple effects of this healing. Marcus's art evolved, becoming more authentic and emotionally resonant than ever before. But more importantly, he began to carry Whisper's gift of sacred listening into his own relationships, creating space for others to be heard without judgment, to be seen without being fixed. As the reflection began to fade, Zephyrina felt a deep resonance with the lesson it contained. She rose from her meditation stone and walked to her cottage, where she opened her journal and wrote, "The greatest gift we can offer another soul is not our words of wisdom, but our willingness to sit with their silence, to witness their pain without trying to fix it, and to trust that healing happens not through our interventions, but through the sacred presence of being truly seen and accepted." She closed the journal and prepared for sleep, her heart full of appreciation for all the unspoken conversations that shaped the human experience, for the courage required to speak, and the wisdom needed to listen for the healing that happens in the spaces between words. Lesson. Sometimes, the most profound healing we can offer others is not our advice or solutions, but our willingness to sit with their pain in sacred silence, trusting that being truly witnessed is often the beginning of all healing. Story 5. The Collector of Lost Moments. The fifth evening arrived with the quality of light that photographers dream about, golden and soft, filtering through clouds that seemed painted by invisible brushes. Zephyrina approached the Lotus Pond with a sense of anticipation, knowing that each evening brought its own unique wisdom, wrapped in the stories that lived within the water's depths. Tonight, the lotus blossoms seemed to pulse with their own inner rhythm, as if keeping time with a celestial heartbeat that only they could hear. She settled onto her meditation stone, feeling the familiar embrace of its warmth against her body. The evening air carried the scent of jasmine and distant rain, and somewhere in the trees, a nightingale was practicing scales, its voice weaving through the twilight like silver thread through dark silk. As she closed her eyes and began to breathe with the rhythm of the settling day, she felt the familiar tingle of awareness that signaled the pond's readiness to share another story. The water's surface began its mystical transformation tonight, taking the form of a vast library, not of books, but of moments, shelves upon shelves of crystallized time, stretched into infinity, each containing instances of human experience that had been lived once and then forgotten, lost to the relentless forward movement of daily life. The reflections showed a curator of these lost moments, someone whose calling was to gather and preserve the fleeting experiences that make up the true treasure of human existence. Within this library of moments appeared the figure of ephemera timekeeper, a woman whose appearance defied age, and whose eyes held the accumulated wisdom of countless observed experiences. She moved through the world with the careful attention of someone who understood that every moment was both eternal and vanishing, that the present was the only place where life actually happened, and that most people spent their entire lives missing the very experiences they were living. Ephemera had discovered her calling by accident, though she had come to understand that there were no accidents, only appointments we make with ourselves before we remember making them. She had been a busy executive, rushing through her days with the single-minded focus of someone who believed that happiness lay just beyond the next achievement, the next promotion, the next goal accomplished. Her transformation had begun on what should have been the most triumphant day of her career. After years of working 18-hour days, sacrificing relationships and health for professional success, she had finally reached the pinnacle she had been climbing toward: the corner office, the impressive title, the salary that would allow her to buy everything she had ever wanted. But as she sat in her new office that first morning, looking out at the city through floor-to-ceiling windows that made her feel like she was floating above the world, she realized she couldn't remember the journey that had brought her there. The years of her life had passed in a blur of meetings and deadlines, of rushing toward the future, while the present slipped through her fingers like water. Through the pond's revelation, Zephyrina watched as Ephemera's awakening unfolded. That morning, in her corner office, she had opened her laptop to begin what she assumed would be another day of important work, but instead found herself staring at a photograph that had been sitting on her desk for months, without her really seeing it. It was a picture of her nephew's birthday party taken the previous year. In the background, barely visible, was her own face looking down at her phone, instead of at the boy blowing out his candles. That image had shattered something inside her. She realized that she had been present for countless precious moments, without actually being present at all. She had attended family gatherings, while mentally composing emails, had sat through sunsets, while planning tomorrow's schedule, had shared meals with friends, while her mind was already racing ahead to the next obligation. The pond's reflection showed Ephemera's decision to resign from her position, a choice that bewildered everyone who knew her. She had given up everything she had worked for to begin a new kind of work, the collection and preservation of moments that people were too busy to fully experience themselves. She became a professional presence, someone who would attend life's important events, not as a participant, but as a witness, capturing not just images, but the essence of moments that would otherwise be lost to distraction and busyness. She developed an almost supernatural ability to see the sacred in the ordinary, to notice the small miracles that unfolded continuously in the space between one breath and the next. Zephyrina watched as Ephemera's work evolved. She began attending weddings, not as a photographer, but as someone who could capture the glance between grandmother and granddaughter during the ceremony, the way the bride's father's hands trembled slightly as he walked her down the aisle, the moment when the couple first saw each other, and time seemed to stop entirely. She was present at graduations, births, and celebrations, but also at the smaller moments that made up the texture of daily life. She witnessed the way morning light fell across a kitchen table where an elderly couple shared their coffee in comfortable silence. She observed the patience of a mother teaching her child to tie shoes, the genuine laughter of friends sharing a joke, the simple contentment of a man reading a book in his garden. But Ephemera's true gift was not just witnessing these moments, but helping others to see them as well. She developed a practice of sharing her observations with the people she encountered, not as judgments or instructions, but as gentle invitations to notice what was already there, waiting to be experienced. The pond's reflection showed a scene that embodied Ephemera's transformed purpose. She was sitting in a park where a young mother was pushing her toddler on a swing, while simultaneously trying to manage a work phone call. The mother was clearly stressed, torn between professional responsibilities and present moment connection with her child. Ephemera approached gently and asked if she could sit nearby. After the mother finished her call, Ephemera began to describe what she had witnessed. The pure joy on the child's face each time the swing reached its highest point, the way the afternoon light caught in his hair, the complete trust in his eyes as he looked at his mother, the beautiful contradiction of holding on and letting go that the swing represented. As Ephemera spoke, the mother began to cry, not from sadness, but from the profound recognition of what she had been missing. She had been present for this moment with her child, but she hadn't been present to it. The difference between physical presence and conscious awareness became clear to her in a way that changed everything. The pond's vision expanded to show the ripple effects of ephemera's work. The people she encountered began to develop their own practices of presence. The mother from the park started leaving her phone in the car when she took her children to play. A businessman ephemera had met at a coffee shop began taking walking meetings, discovering that the rhythm of steps and the changing scenery helped him be more present with his colleagues. Families started creating moment rituals, designated times when all devices were put away and attention was focused entirely on being together. Couples began practicing presence dates, where they would simply sit together and notice what was happening in the shared space between them. Ephemera's work taught people that the most extraordinary experiences were often hiding in plain sight within the most ordinary moments. The way steam rose from a cup of tea, the sound of rain on windows, the feeling of a hand in another hand. These were not interruptions to be rushed through, but invitations to touch the divine that lives within every present moment. The pond's reflection showed ephemera years later now, teaching workshops on the art of presence. Her students were not meditation experts or spiritual seekers, but ordinary people who had begun to suspect that they were missing their own lives. She taught them that presence was not a technique to be mastered, but a way of being that was already available in every moment, waiting to be remembered. Her workshops were simple but profound. Students would spend entire sessions just drinking tea, noticing the temperature, the taste, the way the liquid felt in their mouths. They would practice walking meditation, feeling each step as a connection to the earth that supported them. They would sit in pairs and practice the art of being fully present with another person without agenda or distraction. But perhaps most importantly, ephemera taught her students that the collection of moments was not something that happened in addition to living life, but was the very essence of living life fully. Every breath, every heartbeat, every sensation was a gift that could be either received consciously or missed entirely. As the vision in the pond began to fade, Zephyrina felt a deep appreciation for the lesson it contained. She realized that her own evening practice of receiving wisdom from the Lotus Pond was itself a form of moment collection, a deliberate choice to be present to the stories that lived within stillness and silence. She rose from her meditation stone and walked to her cottage, where she opened her journal and wrote, "The most precious treasures are not the experiences we accumulate, but the moments we actually inhabit. Life is not a series of events to be conquered, but a continuous invitation to be present to the extraordinary gift of consciousness itself." She closed the journal and prepared for sleep, her awareness filled with gratitude for the simple miracle of being alive in this moment, breathing this breath, feeling this heartbeat, existing in the eternal, now that contains all of time within its infinite embrace. Lesson: the richest life is not measured by the number of experiences we accumulate, but by the depth of presence we bring to each moment, transforming ordinary instances into sacred encounters with the divine that lives within the eternal now. Story 6, The Weaver of Invisible Threads. The sixth evening brought with it the kind of silence that feels alive, pregnant with possibilities that exist in the spaces between thoughts. Zephyrina walked to the lotus pond as the last rays of sunlight painted the water in shades of copper and gold, each ripple catching light like scattered coins from some celestial treasure. The lotus blossoms tonight seemed to lean toward each other, as if sharing secrets that only flowers could understand. She settled onto her meditation stone, feeling the accumulated wisdom of 5 previous evenings held within its surface. Tonight, there was something different in the air, a sense of connection that transcended the physical world, as if invisible threads were weaving themselves through the fabric of reality, connecting all beings in ways that the mind couldn't comprehend, but the heart could feel. As her breathing deepened, the pond's surface began its mystical transformation. Tonight the reflections took the form of a vast web, not the kind that traps, but the kind that connects threads of light stretching between all living beings, pulsing with the rhythm of shared consciousness. The water showed how every action, every thought, every moment of kindness or cruelty sent ripples along these invisible threads, affecting beings far beyond what the eye could see. Within this web of connection appeared the figure of Cordelia Threadspinner, a woman whose very presence seemed to make visible the invisible connections that bound all things together. She moved through the world with the awareness of someone who understood that no one existed in isolation, that every life was part of a larger tapestry being woven by the collective choices of all beings. Cordelia lived in a small apartment above a used bookstore in a neighborhood where people prided themselves on their independence and self-reliance. The residents were mostly successful professionals who had learned to navigate life through individual achievement and personal responsibility. They were kind enough neighbors, offering polite greetings and occasional help during emergencies, but each family lived within the carefully maintained boundaries of their private lives. But Cordelia saw what others couldn't see, the invisible threads that connected every person in the neighborhood, the ways their lives intertwined in patterns too subtle for casual observation. She noticed how Mrs. Chen's morning garden watering routine provided a sense of rhythm and continuity that helped the insomniac teenager next door find peace in his troubled nights. She observed how the elderly man's daily chess games in the park created a gathering place that drew others into community without them realizing it. Through the pond's revelation, Zephyrina watched as Cordelia's gift for seeing connections had developed. As a child, she had been labeled overly sensitive, too aware of other people's emotions, too affected by the moods and energies of those around her. Teachers had tried to help her develop stronger boundaries. Friends had advised her to worry less about others and focus more on herself. But Cordelia had gradually learned that her sensitivity was not a weakness to be overcome, but a gift to be understood and used wisely. She had begun to see that the invisible threads connecting all beings carried more than just energy and emotion. They carried opportunities for healing moments when the right action by one person could transform the entire web in ways that rippled outward indefinitely. Her calling became learning to read these threads and act upon the guidance they provided. The pond's reflection showed a particular morning when Cordelia's ability to see connections led to what others might call a coincidence, but she understood as conscious participation in the web of relationship. She had been walking to work when she noticed that the threads connecting her neighbors seemed unusually agitated, vibrating with a frequency that spoke of approaching crisis. Following this intuitive guidance, she had taken an unusual route to the subway station, one that led her past the apartment building, where Marcus, a young father, was having what appeared to be a breakdown on the front steps. He was crying openly, his phone pressed to his ear, as he tried to explain to someone that he couldn't make it to work because his babysitter had canceled at the last minute and his wife was out of town on business. Most people would have walked past, respecting his privacy, or simply not wanting to get involved in a stranger's problems. But Cordelia could see the threads connecting Marcus to the web of relationships in the neighborhood, and she could sense that this moment was a crucial junction where the entire pattern could shift toward greater connection or deeper isolation. She approached Marcus gently and offered to watch his daughter for the day. He looked at her with the suspicion that urban living had trained into him. After all, she was essentially a stranger, offering to care for his most precious treasure. But something in Cordelia's presence, the way she seemed to already understand his situation without judgment, convinced him to accept her offer. The pond's vision expanded to show the ripple effects of the single act of connection. Cordelia's day with Marcus's daughter became an opportunity for both of them to experience the joy of intergenerational relationship. The little girl helped Cordelia see her own neighborhood through fresh eyes, pointing out details that had become invisible through familiarity. Cordelia shared stories and wisdom that planted seeds in the child's developing understanding of how the world worked. But the deeper impact came from how the single act of assistance shifted the entire web of neighborhood relationships. Marcus, overwhelmed with gratitude, began looking for ways to offer similar help to others. He started an informal childcare exchange network, connecting parents who could support each other during emergencies and scheduling conflicts. Mrs. Chen, witnessing this act of kindness, began inviting neighbors to share produce from her garden, creating opportunities for casual conversations that deepened into genuine friendships. The elderly chess player started teaching children the game, creating bridges between generations that had previously existed in isolation. Zephyrina watched as Cordelia's ability to see and act upon the invisible threads of connection gradually transformed her entire neighborhood. But more importantly, she began teaching others to recognize these threads in their own lives, to understand that their individual actions were never truly individual, but always part of a larger pattern of cause and effect that extended far beyond their ability to see. The pond's reflections showed Cordelia years later facilitating workshops she called web awareness, gatherings where people learned to perceive the interconnectedness that was always present but rarely acknowledged. Her students came from all walks of life, drawn by a growing sense that their individual efforts to find meaning and purpose were incomplete without understanding their place in the larger web of relationship. In these workshops, Cordelia taught simple practices that helped people recognize the invisible threads connecting them to others. Students would spend time in public spaces, not observing people, but sensing the emotional atmosphere they created together. They learned to notice how their own mood and energy affected the people around them, how a genuine smile or a moment of patient listening could shift the entire energy of a room. But perhaps most importantly, Cordelia taught her students that working with the web of connection required both action and non-action, both intervention and restraint. Sometimes the threads called for direct assistance, like her offer to help Marcus. But sometimes they called for stepping back, allowing others to find their own solutions, trusting that the web itself would provide what was needed. She taught them to distinguish between healthy connection and codependency, between helpful intervention and controlling manipulation. The web of relationships, she explained, was not about fixing or rescuing others, but about recognizing when their own authentic response to a situation could serve the healing of the whole. The pond's vision showed students from Cordelia's workshops returning to their own communities with transformed awareness. A teacher began to see her classroom not as a collection of individual students, but as a living system where each child's well-being affected all the others. A businessman started making decisions based not just on profit margins, but on the impact those decisions would have on the web of relationships, connecting his company to the larger community. Families began holding regular connection circles, where members would share not just the events of their days, but their awareness of how they were affecting and being affected by each other. Friends started practicing web listening, a form of deep attention that heard not just the words being spoken, but the underlying patterns of connection and disconnection that were seeking healing. As the vision in the pond began to fade, Zephyrina felt a profound recognition of the truth it contained. She realized that her own practice of receiving wisdom from the lotus pond was itself part of the invisible web of connection, that the stories she witnessed were not separate from her own life, but intimately woven into the fabric of her being. She rose from her meditation stone and walked to her cottage, where she opened her journal and wrote, "We are never truly alone, for we exist within an infinite web of connection that links every heartbeat to every other heartbeat, every breath to every other breath. When we learn to see and honor these invisible threads, our smallest actions become service to the healing of the whole." She closed the journal and prepared for sleep, her awareness filled with gratitude for all the invisible threads that connected her to every being who had ever lived or would ever live, understanding that every moment of genuine presence was a gift to the entire web of existence. Lesson: our individual lives are threads in an infinite web of connection, and when we learn to see and honor these invisible bonds, our smallest acts of kindness become healing forces that ripple outward to transform the whole tapestry of existence. The residents had long ago nicknamed it the waiting room, a designation that spoke to their sense of existing in the liminal space between life and whatever came after. Most of the staff at Sunset Manor were kind and competent, providing excellent physical care and maintaining the dignity of their residents. But Memoria had noticed something that others seemed to miss: the way people began to disappear long before their bodies stopped breathing. As residents lost their independence, their social connections, their sense of purpose, they began to fade from the awareness of the world around them, becoming invisible even to themselves. Through the pond's revelation, Zephyrina watched as Memoria's calling had emerged from her work as a night shift aide at the facility. During the quiet hours, when most residents slept, she had begun spending time with those who couldn't sleep, listening to the stories they told in the darkness when the defenses of daylight were lowered and truth came more easily. She had discovered in these midnight conversations that each resident carried within them entire worlds of experience, adventures and love affairs, moments of profound insight, small acts of daily courage that had never been recorded or celebrated. But more tragically, she realized that many of these elders believed their stories no longer mattered, that their lives had become footnotes in other people's narratives. The pond's reflection showed a particular night that had changed everything for Memoria. She was sitting with Rose Delacroix, an 89-year-old woman whose advanced dementia had made her largely nonverbal during daylight hours. The medical staff had written Rose off as gone existing in a twilight state where meaningful communication was impossible. But during this quiet night conversation, Rose had suddenly become lucid, her eyes focusing with startling clarity as she began to speak about her work as a codebreaker during the war, work that had been classified for decades and that she had never been able to discuss with anyone. For 2 hours, Rose shared stories of intellectual challenge and patriotic service, of being one of the few women in a field dominated by men, of the satisfaction of solving puzzles that helped save lives. As dawn approached and Rose's clarity began to fade back into the fog of dementia, she had looked at Memoria with desperate intensity and whispered, "Please remember that I was here. Please remember that I mattered." That plea had awakened something in Memoria that transformed her understanding of her role at Sunset Manor. She began what she called the collection, a systematic gathering of the stories, experiences, and wisdom of every resident, creating detailed records, not just of their medical needs, but of their human essence. Zephyrina watched as Memoria developed her practice of deep biographical listening. She would spend hours with each resident, sometimes over multiple sessions spanning weeks or months, creating space for them to share not just the highlight reel of their lives, but the quiet moments that had shaped them, the small choices that had determined their character, the seemingly insignificant experiences that had taught them how to be human. With residents like Rose, who experienced periods of clarity surrounded by confusion, Memoria learned to recognize the windows when deep communication was possible. She kept a recorder always ready, capturing not just the stories themselves, but the particular way each person's voice carried the music of their unique perspective on existence. For residents whose memories had become fragmented, Memoria developed the art of listening to emotional truth rather than factual accuracy. She understood that the feelings carried within confused narratives were often more important than the literal details, that someone's fear or joy or sense of accomplishment was real, regardless of whether the events they described had happened exactly as they remembered. The pond's reflection expanded to show how Memoria's work began to transform the entire atmosphere of Sunset Manor. As residents realized that their stories were being truly heard and preserved, they began to come alive in ways that surprised everyone, including themselves. People who had been withdrawn and depressed discovered renewed sense of purpose in sharing their experiences with younger generations. Memoria started organizing what she called wisdom circles, gatherings where residents would share specific kinds of knowledge they had accumulated over their lifetimes. Martha, who had raised 7 children during the Great Depression, taught practical skills for making do with less. Frank, who had worked as a carpenter for 50 years, shared not just technical knowledge, but wisdom about the patience required to create something beautiful and lasting. But perhaps most importantly, the residents began to see each other differently. Instead of fellow travelers on the road to irrelevance, they recognized each other as libraries of human experience, repositories of wisdom that the world desperately needed, but was in danger of losing. The pond's vision showed how Memoria's work extended beyond the walls of Sunset Manor. She began creating audio archives that could be shared with the residents, extended families, helping grandchildren and great-grandchildren understand the full complexity of the elders they had known only in their declining years. She partnered with local schools, arranging visits where residents could share their stories with students, studying history, literature, or simply trying to understand what it meant to live a meaningful life. These intergenerational conversations became transformative for both sides. Young people gained perspective on their current challenges, while elders rediscovered their relevance and value. Memoria also worked with families who were struggling to connect with elderly relatives, whose personalities had been changed by illness or cognitive decline. She helped them understand that the person they had known was still present, perhaps buried under layers of confusion or fear, but accessible to those who knew how to listen with patience and love. The pond's reflection showed a scene that captured the essence of Memoria's transformed understanding. She was sitting with a man named Eugene, who had been a renowned surgeon before Alzheimer's began erasing his technical knowledge. His family visited dutifully, but struggled to find common ground with someone who could no longer remember their names or recognize their faces. But Memoria had discovered that while Eugene's recent memories had disappeared, his deeper understanding of healing remained intact. When she asked him not about medical procedures, but about what it meant to hold another person's life in your hands, Eugene's face had illuminated with recognition and wisdom. He spoke eloquently about the sacred responsibility of healing, about the humility required to work with forces larger than individual expertise, about the way touching another person's pain could transform the healer as much as the patient. This conversation had been recorded and shared with Eugene's son, who was also a physician. Hearing his father's voice carrying such profound wisdom about their shared calling had restored a connection that seemed lost forever, reminding him that his father was still present in ways that transcended memory and recognition. As the vision in the pond began to fade, Zephyrina felt a deep appreciation for the lesson it contained. She realized that her own practice of receiving and recording wisdom from the Lotus Pond was itself a form of remembering, a way of ensuring that the stories that lived within stillness would not be lost to the rushing forward movement of time. She rose from her meditation stone and walked to her cottage, where she opened her journal and wrote, "Every being who has ever lived carries within them irreplaceable wisdom gained through the unique alchemy of their individual experience." When we take time to truly listen to each other's stories, we preserve not just personal history, but the collective understanding that makes us human. She closed the journal and prepared for sleep, her heart full of gratitude for all the unnamed teachers who had walked this earth before her, understanding that every moment of genuine attention to another's story was an act of reverence for the sacred mystery of consciousness expressing itself through countless unique forms. Lesson: each person carries within them irreplaceable wisdom born from their unique journey through existence. And when we take time to truly hear each other's stories, we preserve the collective understanding that makes us fully human. Story 8. The Dancer of Unseen Rhythms. The eighth evening arrived with the kind of stillness that makes the heart remember its own ancient rhythm, carrying the promise of deeper mysteries, waiting to unfold in the spaces between one breath and the next. Zephyrina approached the Lotus Pond as twilight wrapped the world in layers of deep indigo and silver, each star emerging like a note in a celestial symphony that only the soul could hear. The lotus blossoms tonight seemed to sway, without wind, moving to music that existed beyond the reach of ordinary senses. She settled onto her meditation stone, feeling the accumulated wisdom of 7 previous evenings resonating within its surface like harmonics from a bell struck long ago. Tonight, there was something different in the air, a pulsing quality that suggested movement even within stillness, rhythm even within silence, dance even within perfect rest. As she closed her eyes and began to breathe with the natural cadence of the settling night, she felt her heartbeat synchronizing with something larger than herself. The pond's surface began its mystical transformation tonight, taking the form of a vast dance floor where movement and stillness existed in perfect harmony. The water showed scenes of beings who moved not just with their bodies, but with their entire existence, dancing to rhythms that emerged from the deepest sources of life itself. Colors flowed in patterns that followed musical laws older than time, creating choreographies of meaning that spoke directly to the heart's understanding. Within this flowing dance appeared the figure of Rhythm's soul weaver, a woman whose every gesture seemed to translate invisible music into visible grace. She existed in a state of perpetual movement that was somehow also perfect stillness, her being a living demonstration of the paradox that the deepest rest could only be found within authentic motion, and the truest movement could only emerge from profound inner quiet. Rhythm lived in a converted warehouse in the industrial district of a city where people had forgotten how to move with natural grace. The neighborhood was filled with the angular urgency of modern life. Sharp corners, straight lines, movements dictated by efficiency, rather than beauty, rhythms imposed by machines, rather than discovered within the organic flow of existence. But within her vast studio space, Rhythm had created something different, a sanctuary where the ancient dance between movement and stillness could be remembered and practiced. Through the pond's revelation, Zephyrina watched as Rhythm's calling had emerged from her own journey through the landscape of disconnection that characterized contemporary life. She had once been a successful corporate consultant, helping companies optimize their workflows and maximize their productivity. Her days had been filled with scheduled meetings, strategic planning sessions, and the relentless pursuit of measurable outcomes. But gradually, she had begun to notice something disturbing about the way people moved through their professional lives. Bodies held in rigid postures that defied natural alignment, gestures constrained by social expectations, voices stripped of their natural music and reduced to efficient information transfer. People walked as if they were carrying invisible burdens, sat as if their bodies were uncomfortable machines, spoke as if their words had no connection to the deeper rhythms of their hearts. The pond's reflection showed the moment of rhythm's awakening. She had been facilitating a particularly tense board meeting when she noticed that everyone in the room was breathing in a shallow, synchronized pattern that matched the fluorescent lighting's imperceptible flicker. Bodies were locked in defensive postures. Voices were pitched at frequencies that created subtle stress responses, and the entire room pulsed with an artificial rhythm that was slowly draining the life force from everyone present. In that moment, rhythm had stood up and begun to breathe differently, deeply, naturally, following the organic rhythm of her own heartbeat, rather than the imposed tempo of corporate urgency. As her breathing changed, her posture shifted, her voice found its natural resonance, and something extraordinary happened. Without saying anything about what she was doing, her transformed presence began to influence the entire room. One by one, the other meeting participants began to breathe more deeply. Their shoulders relaxed slightly. Their voices softened into more natural tones. The content of their discussion didn't change, but the quality of their interaction transformed completely. They began to listen to each other with greater attention, to speak with more authenticity, to find creative solutions that emerged from genuine collaboration rather than competitive positioning. That meeting had been Rhythm's last day as a corporate consultant. She had resigned to begin exploring what she came to understand as the lost art of natural rhythm, the ability to move through life in harmony with the deeper pulses that governed everything from heartbeats to seasonal cycles, from the ebb and flow of creativity to the natural rhythms of rest and activity that supported sustainable well-being. Zephyrina watched as Rhythm developed her practice of teaching others to rediscover their authentic movement patterns. Her studio became a place where people could remember how to walk without hurrying, how to sit without collapsing, how to breathe without forcing, how to speak without performing. But Rhythm's work went far deeper than physical movement. She had discovered that every person carried within them a unique rhythm that was like a fingerprint of their soul, a natural tempo and flow that, when honored and expressed, brought them into alignment with their deepest purpose and most authentic self-expression. The pond's reflection showed her working with Maya, a young woman who had come to the studio carrying the kind of chronic anxiety that had become epidemic in modern society. Maya moved through the world in a constant state of rushing toward the next obligation, her body always slightly ahead of her breath, her thoughts racing faster than her ability to process them peacefully. Rhythm began, not by teaching Maya new movements, but by helping her discover the natural rhythm that lived beneath her acquired patterns of hurry and worry. They started with simple breathing exercises, but instead of following prescribed patterns, Maya learned to find the breathing rhythm that felt most natural to her unique nervous system and energy flow. As Maya's breathing found its authentic pattern, her entire way of moving began to transform. Her walking became more fluid, her gestures more graceful, her voice more resonant. But more importantly, her relationship to time itself shifted. Instead of feeling chased by her schedule, she began to move through her days with a sense of dancing partnership with the natural rhythms of her energy and attention. The pond's vision expanded to show how rhythms teaching affected not just individual students, but entire communities. She began offering workshops in offices, schools, and community centers, teaching groups how to find collective rhythms that supported both individual authenticity and group harmony. In corporate settings, she taught teams how to recognize and work with the natural energy cycles that affected their productivity and creativity. Instead of forcing the same pace throughout the day, groups learned to alternate between periods of focused intensity and restorative quiet, creating work rhythms that sustained energy rather than depleting it. In schools, she worked with teachers to understand how different students learned best when they could follow their natural attention rhythms rather than being forced into artificial patterns of concentration. Classrooms became more dynamic, with movement and stillness alternating in ways that supported rather than fought against the organic learning processes of developing minds. But perhaps most significantly, rhythm taught people to recognize the difference between imposed rhythms and discovered rhythms. The modern world was full of artificial tempos, the speed of traffic, the pace of media, consumption, the relentless pressure of productivity demands that pulled people away from their natural flow states and created the chronic stress that was undermining both individual and collective well-being. The Pond's reflections showed rhythm years later, teaching what she called rhythm literacy, the ability to discern which rhythms served life and which rhythms depleted it. Her students learned to notice how different environments, activities, and relationships affected their natural energy flow, developing the sensitivity to make choices that supported, rather than undermined, their authentic rhythm. She taught them that finding their natural rhythm was not about moving slowly or quickly, but about moving authentically, at the pace that allowed them to be fully present to their experience, fully connected to their deeper wisdom, fully available for genuine relationship with others. A businessman learned to recognize when his natural creativity was peaking and scheduled his most important work during those times, rather than forcing innovation during periods when his energy was naturally inclined toward more routine tasks. A mother discovered that honoring her own rhythms of activity and rest made her more patient and present with her children, creating a family environment that supported everyone's natural flow. The Pond's vision showed how rhythm's work created ripple effects that extended far beyond her direct teaching. Students carried their understanding of natural rhythm into their relationships, their work, their parenting, their creative pursuits. They became ambassadors for a different way of moving through the world, one that honored the organic wisdom of the body, the natural cycles of energy and attention, the deeper rhythms that connected individual well-being to the well-being of the whole. Communities began to organize themselves differently, creating schedules that honored both individual and collective rhythms. Families found natural patterns of gathering and solitude that supported both togetherness and autonomy. Workplaces discovered that productivity actually increased when people were allowed to work in harmony with their natural energy cycles, rather than against them. As the vision in the pond began to fade, Zephyrina felt a deep recognition of the wisdom it had shared. She realized that her own practice of evening meditation by the Lotus Pond was itself a form of rhythm practice, a way of synchronizing her inner tempo with the deeper rhythms of nature and consciousness. She rose from her meditation stone and walked to her cottage, her movement naturally flowing in harmony with the gentle rhythm of her heartbeat and breath. In her journal, she wrote, "Beneath the imposed rhythms of modern life lies our authentic tempo, a natural flow that connects us to the deepest sources of vitality and wisdom. When we learn to honor and express our true rhythm, we become instruments in the great symphony of existence, each playing our unique part in the music of the whole." She closed the journal and prepared for sleep, her body settling into the natural rhythm of rest. Her dreams filled with the gentle dance of moonlight on water, carrying the wisdom of authentic movement into the peaceful depths of night. Lesson: beneath the hurried pace of modern life lies our authentic rhythm, a natural flow that, when honored and expressed, connects us to our deepest vitality and allows us to move through the world as dancers in the great symphony of existence. Story 9, The Guardian of Sacred Questions. The ninth evening arrived with the quality of light that exists only in the deep heart of contemplative seasons, when the boundary between day and night becomes a threshold where wisdom likes to gather and whisper its secrets to those patient enough to listen. Zephyrina approached the lotus pond as twilight painted the world in shades of deep violet and pearl, each lotus blossom seeming to hold within its petals questions that had been asked since the beginning of time, but never fully answered. She settled onto her meditation stone, feeling the accumulated presence of 8 previous evenings held within its ancient surface, like layers of understanding built one upon another. Tonight, there was something different in the atmosphere, a sense of approaching completion, yet also of beginning, as if the stories she had witnessed were weaving themselves into a larger tapestry whose pattern was only now becoming visible. As her breathing found its natural depth, the pond's surface began its mystical transformation. Tonight, the reflections took the form of a vast question mark, written in flowing water, and starlight, its curves containing within them not answers, but invitations to deeper inquiry. The water showed scenes of beings who had learned that the quality of their questions determined the quality of their lives, that asking the right question was often more transformative than finding any particular answer. Within this flowing inquiry appeared the figure of Sophia Questweaver, a woman whose entire presence seemed to emanate the kind of wondering that opens doors rather than closes them. She moved through the world with the gentle curiosity of someone who understood that the most profound mysteries were not problems to be solved, but invitations to be lived, not riddles requiring clever answers, but koans designed to transform the very nature of the one who contemplated them. Sophia lived in a small cottage that had been built around an ancient oak tree, its rooms flowing organically around the massive trunk that served as both literal and metaphorical center of her dwelling. The tree had been growing in that spot for over 300 years, its roots extending deep into the earth's wisdom, its branches reaching toward understanding that existed beyond the grasp of ordinary consciousness. Sophia had chosen to build her life around this tree because she recognized it as a teacher of the kind of patience and depth that genuine inquiry required. Through the pond's revelation, Zephyrina watched as Sophia's calling had emerged from her work as a therapist in a world increasingly dominated by quick fixes and surface solutions. She had originally been trained in conventional approaches that focused on diagnosing problems and implementing interventions, but gradually she had become aware that the most profound healing happened not when people found answers to their difficulties, but when they discovered more helpful questions to ask about their experience. The pond's reflection showed a pivotal session early in Sophia's career when a client named David had come to her, carrying what he described as chronic depression that had resisted every form of treatment he had tried. He arrived at her office with a list of symptoms, a detailed history of failed medications, and a sense of resignation that suggested he had given up hope of ever feeling genuinely happy. But instead of beginning with the traditional questions about symptoms and history, Sophia had found herself asking David something unexpected. What would you do if you discovered that your depression was not something wrong with you, but something trying to communicate with you? The question had stopped David mid-sentence in his recitation of familiar complaints. For several minutes, he sat in silence, not because he didn't know how to answer, but because the question had created a shift in his entire relationship to his experience. Instead of seeing his depression as an enemy to be defeated, he began to consider it as a messenger carrying information he had been too frightened or busy to receive. This single question had opened a doorway into a completely different kind of therapeutic exploration. Instead of focusing on eliminating David's symptoms, they began investigating what his depression might be trying to protect him from, what it might be trying to tell him about his life circumstances, what wisdom it might contain about changes he needed to make, but had been afraid to consider. Zephyrina watched as Sophia's practice evolved around what she came to call sacred inquiry, the art of asking questions that invited people into deeper relationship with their own experience rather than analyzing it from a distance. She discovered that the right question at the right moment could accomplish more healing than months of conventional intervention. But Sophia's work extended far beyond individual therapy. She began to understand that the quality of questions that individuals asked themselves directly affected the quality of questions that families, communities, and entire societies asked about their challenges and possibilities. The Pond's reflection showed Sophia facilitating what she called community inquiry circles, gatherings where groups could explore together the questions that were seeking attention in their collective life. Instead of starting with predetermined agendas or trying to solve specific problems, these circles began with an invitation to discover what questions wanted to be asked. She worked with a neighborhood that had been struggling with increasing crime and social fragmentation. Instead of focusing immediately on security measures and law enforcement strategies, Sophia guided them to ask deeper questions. What does our community most need to feel safe? What would it look like if we trusted each other? How can we create connection across the differences that currently divide us? These questions opened conversations that led to innovations no one had previously imagined. Instead of simply increasing police presence, community members began organizing regular gatherings where people could get to know their neighbors. Instead of focusing only on preventing crime, they created mentorship programs that gave young people positive outlets for their energy and ambition. The Pond's vision expanded to show how Sophia's approach to sacred questioning affected every area of life where she applied it. In schools, she taught teachers to replace "what's wrong with the student" with "what does the student need to thrive?" In healthcare settings, she helped practitioners ask not just "what disease does this person have?" but "what does this person's body need to remember its natural healing capacity?" But perhaps most importantly, Sophia taught people to apply sacred inquiry to their own inner lives. She helped them replace questions that created limitation and suffering. Why does this always happen to me? What's wrong with me? When will I finally be happy? With questions that opened possibilities and invited growth. The Pond's reflection showed her working with Elena, a young woman who had been trapped in cycles of self-criticism and perfectionism that were preventing her from taking creative risks or forming intimate relationships. Elena's internal dialogue was dominated by harsh questions. Why can't I do anything right? What if I fail? What will people think of me? Sophia taught Elena to notice these limiting questions and gently replace them with inquiries that supported her growth. What would I attempt if I knew I was supported? How can I honor both my desire for excellence and my need for self-compassion? What would love do in this situation? As Elena practiced this transformed way of questioning, her entire life began to shift. Instead of being paralyzed by fear of imperfection, she became curious about what she might discover through experimentation. Instead of avoiding relationships to protect herself from judgment, she began asking what authentic connection might feel like and how she could invite it into her life. The Pond's vision showed Elena, years later, now teaching art to children and carrying forward Sophia's understanding of how questions could transform lives. When her young students said, "I can't draw," Elena would ask them, "What wants to be expressed through your hands today?" When they complained that their artwork didn't look right, she would wonder with them, what if there's no wrong way to create only different ways to explore? Zephyrina watched as Sophia's influence rippled outward through hundreds of people who had learned to replace limiting questions with liberating ones. Parents stopped asking, "How can I make my child behave?" and started wondering, "What does my child need to feel secure and supported?" Partners transformed, "Why doesn't my spouse understand me?" into, "How can we understand each other more deeply?" Entrepreneurs shifted from, "What if my business fails?" to, "What wants to be created through my unique gifts and passion?" The Pond's reflection showed Sophia, in her later years, facilitating what she called question circles, gatherings where people could share the questions that were currently alive in their hearts and receive support in living with those questions rather than rushing to answer them. She had learned that some questions were not meant to be answered quickly, but were designed to be lived with over time, allowing their wisdom to unfold gradually through experience. In these circles, participants discovered that sharing their deepest questions with others created bonds of intimacy and understanding that went far beyond what was possible through sharing answers or opinions. A man, questioning his career path, found support from others who were also navigating transitions. A woman wondering how to care for her aging parents connected with people facing similar challenges. But most importantly, people learned that they were not alone in their uncertainty, that questioning was not a sign of weakness or confusion, but evidence of consciousness growing toward greater wisdom and authenticity. The Pond's vision showed how Sophia's understanding of sacred inquiry had influenced institutions and organizations far from her small cottage. Schools began building curricula around essential questions rather than predetermined answers. Businesses started strategic planning processes that began with inquiring into their deepest purpose rather than focusing only on profit maximization. Healthcare systems began asking not just, "How can we treat more patients efficiently?" but "How can we support the conditions that allow healing to emerge naturally?" Political processes shifted from debates designed to prove who was right toward dialogues designed to discover what was possible when different perspectives were honored. As the vision in the pond began to fade, Zephyrina felt a profound appreciation for the transformation that sacred questioning could bring to any life willing to embrace it. She realized that her own practice of receiving wisdom from the Lotus Pond was itself a form of inquiry, an ongoing question about what wisdom was available when the mind became quiet enough to listen. She rose from her meditation stone and walked to her cottage, her heart full of questions that felt like prayers. What wisdom is seeking to emerge through my life? How can I serve the healing of the world? What questions are ready to be lived today? In her journal, she wrote, "The questions we ask determine the life we live. When we replace limiting inquiries with sacred ones, we transform not just our understanding, but our very experience of existence, opening doorways to possibilities we never imagined." She closed the journal and prepared for sleep, her dreams filled with question marks that bloomed like flowers, each one opening into vast spaces of possibility where wisdom could grow in its own natural timing. Lesson: the quality of questions we ask determines the quality of life we experience. When we learn to ask sacred questions that open rather than limit, we discover that uncertainty becomes a doorway to wisdom rather than a source of suffering. Story 10. The Weaver of Final Threads. The 10th evening arrived with the sacred weight of completion, carrying within its gentle embrace the promise that all stories eventually find their way home, to the silence from which they emerged. Zephyrina approached the Lotus Pond as twilight painted the world in shades of deep gold and infinite blue, each lotus blossom now glowing with the accumulated wisdom of 9 previous evenings. their petals holding within them the essence of every tale that had unfolded upon the water's sacred surface. She settled onto her meditation stone for what she somehow knew would be the final time in this particular cycle of feeling the stone's surface warm with the presence of all the stories that had been witnessed there. Tonight, the air itself seemed to shimmer with completion, as if the universe was preparing to reveal the deeper pattern that had been weaving itself through each individual tale. As her breathing found its familiar depth, the pond's surface began its mystical transformation one last time. Tonight, the reflections took the form of a vast tapestry, where all the previous stories appeared as interwoven threads, each one necessary to the beauty of the whole, each character's journey contributing to a larger wisdom that could only be seen when all the individual tales were viewed together. Within this magnificent tapestry appeared the figure of Synthesis, story weaver, a woman who existed at the intersection of all stories, the place where individual journeys converged into universal understanding. She seemed to be both ancient and timeless, her presence containing echoes of every person whose story had graced the pond's reflections. Cornelius's learning to embrace failure, Melodia's rediscovery of authentic creativity, Seraphina's trust in invisible harvests, Whisper's gift of sacred listening, Ephemera's collection of precious moments, Cordelia's recognition of invisible connections, Memoria's preservation of forgotten wisdom, Rhythm's dance with natural flow, and Sophia's mastery of sacred questions. Synthesis lived everywhere and nowhere, existing in that liminal space where stories become wisdom, where individual experience transforms into collective understanding, where the personal becomes universal without losing its intimate truth. She was both the storyteller and the story, both the seeker and the sought, both the question and the answer that transcends all questions. Through the pond's final revelation, Zephyrina watched as Synthesis's nature was revealed. She was not a person in the ordinary sense, but rather the living embodiment of the principle that connects all stories to their deeper meaning. Every time someone learned from failure, rediscovered authentic expression, trusted in invisible processes, offered sacred listening, collected precious moments, recognized hidden connections, preserved forgotten wisdom, moved in natural rhythm, or asked liberating questions, Synthesis was present as the weaving force that transformed individual experience into collective wisdom. The pond's reflection showed how Synthesis worked through the world. She appeared in the moment when Cornelius finally understood that his failures had been his greatest teachers, present as the invisible force that transformed his pain into compassion. She was there when Melodia's instruments found their voices again, embodying the principle that authentic creativity emerges when we stop trying to be perfect and start allowing ourselves to be real. Zephyrina watched as the pond revealed Synthesis's presence in Seraphina's garden, when she realized that her most important work happened in the invisible realm of consciousness rather than the visible world of plants. She had been there when Whisper created sacred space for Marcus's healing silence, manifesting as the wisdom that knows when to speak and when to simply hold space for another's journey. The reflection showed Synthesis, woven through Ephemera's discovery, that the most precious treasures are the moments we actually inhabit, present as the awareness that transforms ordinary experiences into sacred encounters. She appeared in Cordelia's recognition of the invisible threads connecting all beings, embodying the understanding that no action exists in isolation, but ripples outward to affect the whole web of existence. Synthesis had been present when Memoria preserved the stories of elders whose wisdom might otherwise have been lost, manifesting as the principle that every being carries irreplaceable understanding, gained through their unique passage through existence. She was there in Rhythm's studio when people rediscovered their authentic flow, appearing as the natural intelligence that knows how to move in harmony with life's deeper rhythms. The pond's vision expanded to show synthesis present in Sophia's question circles, embodying the wisdom that the quality of our questions determines the quality of our lives, that sacred inquiry opens doorways to possibilities we never imagined. But most profoundly, Zephyrina realized that synthesis had been present throughout her own 9 evenings of receiving stories from the Lotus Pond. She was the force that had woven each individual tale into a larger understanding, the intelligence that had revealed how apparently separate stories were actually chapters in a single magnificent narrative about the human journey toward wisdom and awakening. The pond's reflection showed how all 10 stories formed a complete teaching about the nature of conscious living. Cornelius had demonstrated that struggle and failure are teachers in disguise. Melodia had shown that authentic creativity emerges when we stop performing and start expressing. Serafina had revealed that our most important service often works invisibly. Whisper had taught that healing happens through sacred presence. Ephemera had illustrated that the richest life is found in present moment awareness. Cordelia had shown that we exist within an infinite web of connection where every action affects the whole. Memoria had demonstrated that every being carries irreplaceable wisdom worth preserving. Rhythm had taught that authentic movement emerges from honoring our natural flow. Sophia had revealed that the questions we ask determine the life we experience. And now Synthesis was showing that all individual stories are threads in a larger tapestry of universal understanding. As Zephyrina watched, she began to understand her own role in this cosmic story. She was not just a passive receiver of wisdom, but an active participant in the great work of transforming individual experience into collective understanding. Every evening she had spent beside the Lotus Pond, every story she had witnessed and recorded, every moment of genuine presence she had offered to the unfolding tales had been acts of service to the larger process of consciousness awakening to itself. The pond's reflection showed her that the stories would not end with this 10th evening, but would continue to ripple outward through everyone who encountered them. Each person who heard Cornelius's story would be invited to see their own failures as teachers. Everyone who witnessed Melodia's journey would remember their own authentic, creative voice. All who learned from Serafina would trust more deeply in the invisible processes of growth and service. Synthesis revealed to Zephyrina that her role was to be a bridge between the realm where wisdom lived in potential and the world where it could be applied in practical service. The stories she had received were not meant to remain beautiful artifacts, but to become living teachings that could transform lives, relationships, and communities. The vision showed how the wisdom contained in these 10 tales could address the deepest challenges facing humanity, the epidemic of isolation, that Cordelia's understanding of connection could heal the crisis of meaning, that Sophia's sacred questions could transform the environmental destruction, that Rhythm's teaching about natural flow could help prevent the loss of elder wisdom, that Memoria's work could preserve. But most importantly, Synthesis showed Zephyrina that every person who encountered these stories would discover their own unique way of contributing to the great work of consciousness evolution. Some would become teachers, like the characters in the tales. Others would apply the wisdom in their daily relationships and work. Still others would carry the understanding forward in ways not yet imagined. As the final vision began to fade, Synthesis offered Zephyrina one last gift, the understanding that stories never truly end, but continue to live and grow in the hearts and minds of all who receive them. The Lotus Pond would continue to reflect wisdom for anyone patient enough to sit beside it in genuine seeking. The teachings would continue to unfold for anyone willing to live the questions and trust the invisible processes of growth and service. Zephyrina rose from her meditation stone for the final time in this cycle, feeling both completion and beginning. She walked to her cottage, where she opened her journal and wrote, "Every individual story is a thread in the infinite tapestry of universal wisdom. When we learn to see our personal experiences as contributions to collective understanding, our lives become acts of service to the awakening of consciousness itself." She closed the journal, knowing that while this particular cycle of receiving was complete, the deeper work of living and sharing the wisdom would continue for as long as beings sought understanding and growth. The Lotus Pond would be there whenever she needed to remember that every story matters, every journey contributes to the whole, and every moment of genuine presence is a gift to the infinite story that includes us all. Lesson: every individual story is sacred thread in the infinite tapestry of human wisdom. When we recognize our personal experiences as contributions to collective awakening, our lives become conscious participation in the eternal story of consciousness, discovering itself through countless unique expressions.